Now.
Now, can you see me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Sergio, yes, we can. We can.
Let's do it this way.
Okay, I think we should get started. So hello and welcome to this Institute for Jewish Policy Research event. My name's Jonathan Boyd. I'm the Executive Director of JPR and I'm going to be hosting the event today. We're really delighted that so many people have chosen to join us. We have about 300 people signed up from 25 different countries across Europe, as well as Israel and the United States. Our topic, of course, is about Jewish life in Europe and what the very latest demographic data tell us about its prospects. But before we start, let me just say a word or two about the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, JPR. JPR is an independent research institute based in the UK that specialises in studying Jewish populations and issues of concern to them here in the UK, across Europe and around the world. Our work is very much policy oriented. We generate data specifically to support community life. And we touch on various different topics, including demography, education, identity, social care, health, economics, anti-Semitism, Israel diaspora relations, and many others. We produce research reports for general consumption, but we also undertake lots of commission studies for organizations ranging from synagogues and schools through major Jewish organizations and foundations, all the way to producing landmark multinational studies for the European Union. And in a world where notions of truth are continually being warped and challenged and undermined, our goal at all times is to try to shed light on empirical reality and to support those concerned with the very best interests of the Jewish people to develop their plans with reference to the latest data. Today's event, of course, focuses on demography, a field of research that's very much at the heart of JPR's work. 2 years ago, we established our European Jewish Demography Unit at JPR, a specialist research unit designed to generate up-to-date demographic data about Jewish populations all over Europe to support community planning there. The unit was established thanks to a generous 3-year grant from the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, and we work daily to produce country-specific reports, demographic issue reports, and up-to-date Jewish population counts for every country in Europe based on the best available sources. And I'm really, really delighted to welcome Sally Berkovich, Daniela Grieber, and Nicola Kobold from Rothschild Hanadiv Europe here today, and to thank them publicly for their support. They're investing in the unit to ensure that all of us have a better understanding of the context in which European Jews live. And they, very much like JPR, are determined to ensure that demographic data about Europe's Jews are utilised to help communities plan for their future. The Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe is one of the most important engines helping to fuel Jewish life across Europe today. So on behalf of JPR, and I'm sure everyone else here today, thank you to Sally, her trustees and professional team for the incredible work that you do. Now, today we're focusing on a report published by our demography unit a couple of months ago called Jews in Europe at the turn of the Millennium, Population Trends and Estimates, which, if you haven't seen it, can be downloaded at no cost from the JPR website, jpr.org.uk. I think it's an essential read for anyone concerned about the future of Europe's Jews. And I say that not simply as executive director of JPR, but equally as an objective analyst of contemporary European Jewry. I say it also because it was written by two of the world's leading Jewish demographers today, Professor Sergio DellaPergola, who's the chairman of JPR's European Jewish Demography Unit, and who I will introduce properly in just a moment, and JPR Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Daniel Staetsky, the director of the unit, who joined the JPR team several years ago after professional stints at Israel Central Bureau of Statistics and at RAND Europe, and who is now applying his vast array of skills in the realms of demography and social statistics to the complexities of contemporary European Jewish life. Professor Sergio DellaPergola is our main speaker this evening. To introduce him properly, he is without question the world's leading expert in Jewish demography today, a former chairman of the Hebrew University's Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry, who over the course of his distinguished career has lectured at universities and research centers all over the world and has served as a policy consultant to the President of Israel and the Israeli government, among many other national and international organizations. He won the renowned Marshall Sklar Award in 1999, the most prestigious international prize for social scientific research on Jews. So we at JPR were absolutely thrilled when he chose to join our team. He brings decades of experience with him, built on the knowledge gained from publishing over 60 books or monographs and over 300 academic papers, variously on historical demography, the family, international migration, Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, and population projections in the diaspora and in Israel. But I have to say, most of all, I was delighted to welcome him to our team because he's a mensch, a man really dedicated to Israel and the Jewish people, who remains as vibrant today as he was in his 20s and who never seems to stop learning. In fact, the well-known maxim from Pirkei Avot, Ezehu Chacham Halomed Mikol Adam, who is wise, the person who learns from everyone, seems to imply to him more than almost any other person I've ever met. Now, let me just very briefly explain the format of today's event. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Professor DellaPergola to present some of the findings from the report and to share his reflections on them. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, after which we will open up the conversation and take questions. So if you'd like to ask a question at any point, you're free to do so. Just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just type in what you want to ask at any point. Please just try to be as succinct as possible. And I will process the questions and then put them both to Professor DellaPergola and to Dr. Daniel Staetsky. Our time, of course, is limited. We only have an hour in total, but I'll do my best to cover as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, let me hand over to my teacher, my colleague, and I have to say a man who inspires me daily, Professor Sergio DellaPergola.
Thank you, John, for your warm welcoming. I'm very pleased and honored to be here at from JPR, indeed from Jerusalem. I wish to thank JPR for the opportunity it has given me to pursue research on European Jews. And I wish to thank particularly Stefan Moss, the chair of the board, you, John, as the director, my colleague Daniel Staetsky, with whom we prepared this report. And I wish to add a warm word of thanks to Mrs. Sally Berkowitz of the Rothschild Foundation and her associates, who really gave support to this project and in fact to the unit that has produced it. I also wish to remind that we have competition tonight because we are broadcasting at the same time of the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris. In fact, you don't see it, but I put on the most American and in fact also British tie that I have in my repertoire. So we shall hope to have a fairly good audience like now in Washington, D.C. European Jewry is at the center of our attention. Tonight, based on this report, which I will soon try to put on screen. In fact, I will proceed now to have the image of my PowerPoint. And and I hope you can see it. Yes, I think it's sufficiently clear. Jews in Europe at the turn of the millennium, population trends and estimates. What we wanted to do was, in fact, primarily to produce a new repertoire of estimates on the number of Jews in each country in Europe, West and East, North and South. And we wanted to do that based on the best data we could find. In fact, although tonight we will not deal really in depth with the sources, it's really a large amount of sources of different qualities. And one of the problems that we have, and I will outline shortly later on, is to try to bring all of these different materials to a common denominator, which allows for comparisons both geographically across countries and also over time to understand the mechanisms of development of Jewish population and society on the European continent. What we did, of course, was not only to establish numbers, but to study the critical processes that stand behind the changes and the different Jewish population distribution, and also try to draw some conclusions. Some of them have, I would say, especially scientific value in terms of comparing Jews and maybe other groups across the spectrum of Europe and internationally to understand whether or not Jews have peculiar socio-demographic characteristics, and insisting also on the very crucial point of identity, group identity, and the quality of corporate Jewish life in the different parts of Europe. And so that's what we tried to do. And without forgetting that the purpose of this study also is to help Jewish communities to produce some better instruments to plan their future. That is, there is also a kind of policy-oriented dimension in what we do. It is not only descriptive, but it hopes also to help communities to organize better their services for to the benefit of Jewish populations in the different corners of Europe. So let me start from a very quick historical overview, which really spans in the long duration for nearly 1,000 years. When we speak of European Jews, in the perspective of world Jewry, we wish to know, first of all, how many they were at different points in time, and also what was their share out of the total Jewish population in the world, comparing that with other parts of the world. At the same time, we were also interested at comparing what happens in the different parts of Europe. Europe can be divided variously in different ways, but fundamentally, the divide between East and West is one simple way of presenting matters, and the pendulum, as I shall return on this in a moment, has shift very significantly over time. But what is interesting in this diagram is to show that the center of gravity of world Jewry has shifted repeatedly in the course of history. Jews were, of course, initially a population centered in the Middle East, and still in the Middle Ages, at least according to the memorials of Benjamin of Tudela, the famous Jewish traveler, around the year 1200. Most of them were still in the Middle East with relatively small presence in Europe. Western Europe is depicted here in the blue color and here in the bottom part. And Eastern Europe was very, very tiny at the time and nearly non-existent. In the course of time, we see some development of Jews in Western Europe, but what is known was the great expulsion from many countries, so the numbers again diminished. And what has happened in the course of modern history, and this again is well known, was the significant growth of Jews in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was a relatively late joiner in terms of the population distribution over the European continent. And this was also the fundamental part of world Jewry where the significant increase in total Jewish population worldwide happened between the early 19th and then the first half of the 20th century. This is depicted here in the reddish part of the column. The number of Jews totally, which ranged around 1 million perhaps until 1700, suddenly grew through the 19th and the 20th century to the maximum historical ever of about 16.5 million on the eve of the Shoah. At the same time, Europe was the main basin of origin of vast migrations that reached North America in orange here, and also Latin America and other distant parts transoceanic. What we see, therefore, is the initial dominance of the West, then the dominance of the east part of the continent, then the tragedy of the Shoah, the dramatic reduction in the total number of Jews worldwide, which mostly affected Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe was affected as well. And then we have the last 70 years or so in which the Jewish population in the world has recovered partly. It has not reached yet the numbers that prevailed before the Holocaust. America has become the big player, and more recently, the state of Israel has become initially number 2 and gradually number 1 in world Jewish population. Whereas Europe, Eastern Europe, has significantly diminished as a consequence of the large exodus from the former Soviet Union, and Western Europe is more stable, and as we will see, is basically the main object of our presentation tonight. What is also interesting is to see how the proportion of Jews in Europe in the long term, which was very minor in the Middle Ages, about 12%, had increased by 1880 to nearly 90% of the total of world Jewry. And then in 2020, as a consequence, yes, of the Shoah, but also of large international intercontinental migration before World War II, and then whatever has happened during the over 75 years since the end of World War II, it has again returned to a relatively minor component of the total. Approximately 10% of the total Jewish population worldwide is concentrated or rather dispersed across the many countries of Western and Eastern Europe. So in a sense, someone might say the rise and fall.
Sergio, sorry to interrupt you.
Although I don't want to say that, because it is not only a matter of quantity, it is also a matter of quality. And undisputably, Europe has been the source of many of the intellectual, political, ideological currents that have animated world Jewry in the course of modern and contemporary Jewish history. Now, the big question is, who is a Jew and how we count the Jews? And here we have a quick exercise, which I call the core periphery gradient of Jewish identity. To simplify matters, we can conceptualize the whole process in a series of concentric circles, at the center of which we have the most strongly identified components of Jewish population. In fact, here we have two concentric circles. The central part, which is the more affiliated either with synagogues or with other types of Jewish organizations, includes many of those who are perhaps the more religious, and those who have certainly a more visible presence in the life of Jewish communities today. Around them, we have a second circle of persons who are also very strongly identified with Judaism, but for whom either affiliation or the religious sector is to some extent less important in their life. There are other ways, and I will outline that in a few moments, of being Jewish, not necessarily the religious factor. Now, this part, the darker blue part, is what I call the core Jewish population, and these are the type of definitions that we have used in our report, in the historical comparisons that we have seen, and also for other purposes in this report. But we should not forget that there are several grades and nuances of being Jewish, maybe partly Jewish. We find today a growing proportion of people who have Jewish parents, but they do not define themselves Jewish anymore. Some of them feel a double affiliation or double allegiance, being Jewish and also being something else. And this is the gray circle that you see here. I call them the population with Jewish parents. Then you have another concept, the enlarged Jewish population, which includes all those who are Jewish, but also the non-Jewish members of Jewish households in an historical and sociological context where many families are composed both of Jews and non-Jews, what we, in familiar terms, we often call intermarriages. These people are strongly connected the ones to the others, and so we cannot totally ignore the non-Jewish part of the equation when we wish to understand the cultural dynamics of a community. Then we have an even more distant circle, the law of return. The law of return is that part of the Israeli legislation that allows people to come to Israel as immigrants and receive immediately Israeli citizenship and voting rights. And this includes not only Jews, but also children and grandchildren of Jews and the respective spouses, whether they are Jewish or not Jewish. So you immediately realize that there is a vast expansion in the number of Jews, or at least of persons of interest when we move to that circle. And then finally, we may find persons with an even more distant Jewish ancestry, kind of genetic markers from very ancient periods, the Roman period, the Inquisition, and people who maybe have a Jewish name without notion that they are Jewish. So when we try to translate those different definitions into numbers, we find that today, by the core definition, we have about 1,300,000 persons who are Jewish, but we have another 500,000 persons who, not being Jewish, have at least a very recent Jewish ancestry. Another 500,000 persons who are not Jewish, but they are connected with Jewish families, and another 500,000 who are more distantly connected, but they might go to Israel if they would so wish. When we decompose, we separate the three main regions of Europe, that is the European Union of the 27, without the UK, because this already takes into account the Brexit. And then other parts of Europe, including the United Kingdom, and finally the former Soviet Union parts who are comprised in Europe. As you can see, the numbers are different, and the largest part is the European Union. But what is also very different is the composition between the core, which is very large here and even larger here, and the more peripheral sections, which may be very significant in the former Soviet Union, but are relatively minor in the UK and some other minor countries in this other part of Europe, and they have some consistency in the European Union 27. Now, let's move to some more qualitative aspects of our research. First of all, the question of being European. We found in our research, which is very much based on the FRA survey of Jewish perceptions of anti-Semitism that was run with the sponsorship of the European Union in 2018. We have very interesting data on the amount of attachment to the European Union by Jews and by the total population. Here you see in blue the percentages showing how much Jews in different countries feel they are attached to the European Union, and how much the total population in red says the same. Nearly without exception, it appears that Jews are more Europeans than their fellow compatriots in the respective countries. Some countries, the difference is quite huge. Take, for example, Hungary, Poland, Austria, and Italy, where in decreasing proportions, the distance between Jews and non-Jews in feeling European is really quite dramatic. In the other countries, Germany, Belgium, France, Spain, UK, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, the differences are minor. By the way, let me just outline that the UK is not the lowest, was not the lowest in terms of their attachment to the European Union. There were countries that felt less involved, and in any case, the Jews had always slightly more attachment, higher attachment than the total population with the political and socioeconomic framework that is the European Union. Of interest is also the way through which Jews feel attached to Judaism. And as we know, of course, there are many different options. Judaism is a multivariate cluster of options. Of course, the religious option is dominant and is in a sense, the precondition to other options. And here in dark blue, we find the proportion of Jews in different countries who say, I'm Jewish because I think Judaism is my religion and therefore I'm Jewish. The highest is the UK, more than 60% in our sample. Incidentally, this is a sample of 16,000 Jews, which is a huge sample in social surveys. Italy, about half, and then other countries in decreasing order. I would say that the countries with a lower incidence of religion as the decisive variable to feel Jewish are mostly in Eastern and Northern Europe, whereas in Southern and Central Europe, and again in the UK, the religious factor is certainly more determinant. Another way of being Jewish is ethnicity. Ethnicity that is the national, non-religious feeling of being Jewish is here appearing, and it comprises about 1/5, but in some countries even more than half of the total mode of attachment of Jews to Judaism. And then there are those who say, I'm Jewish because of my parents, I'm Jewish because of my upbringing, because of culture and other factors. And as you can see, the differences are quite substantial. And fundamentally, there are countries, I would say, with a more traditional outlook of what being Jewish means, and others where it is a sort of residue, something which we might perhaps call somewhat weaker, yet very relevant. We cannot dismiss anyone, as we shall see in a moment. In fact, what our research has found, and this is quite interesting, is a significant amount of strengthening of Jewish identity. I dare to say that contrary to the assumption of growing assimilation, we have proof at different levels and through different indicators of a significant reapproaching to Judaism by significant sections of European Jewry. One example is in this diagram. This diagram shows the proportion of those who did not think they are Jewish when they were raised, that's in blue, and who do not think they are attached to Judaism in red in 2018. That is, yes, they are part of the sample, but they are not really defining themselves as Jewish. And as you see, the proportion being Jewish now is significantly higher, or in other terms, the proportion of those who do not feel really Jewish in our sample is significantly lower in 2018 than it was when they were raised in their childhood, which means that many of these have become more Jewish, or they have become Jewish at all in the course of the span of time between being a child and the current date. Another indication of this somewhat strengthening of Jewish identity all across Europe is provided by data on intermarriage. On the right panel, you have the proportion outmarried among those aged 50 and more. On the left panel, you see those who are outmarried among those who are below age 50. And then if we compare the data of those older and those younger, we find that in the majority of the countries, the younger have a lower proportion of intermarriage than the older. There are, out of 12 countries, 9 countries where the younger generation has a lower percent of intermarriage than the older generation. There are only 3 exceptions. One is Sweden, one is Denmark, and one is Italy. And this means that, again, the Nordic countries perhaps are a cluster of themselves, but in general, there is a greater cohesiveness in the Jewish community among most of the Jewish populations who are younger vis-a-vis their older peers. So a kind of return to the center. And this is a third demonstration of what I'm saying. These lines, again, compare the degree of religiosity, those who define themselves as religious when they were children at childhood, and now according to their current age. Each of these lines exemplifies a different age cohort, a different age group. The elderly are in the bottom, and moving up, we find that basically each age group is younger and also more religious. It is not that the proportion of religious are spectacular. The proportions are fairly low, 5%, 10%, 20%, still a minority of the total sample, but they are moving from fewer among the older to more among the younger. And then another thing which is of obvious interest is that these lines show what was religiosity at childhood and what it is now. And you see that without exception, nearly all of the age groups declare they are more religious now than they were when they were children. That is, there is a growing process of stronger religiosity among Jews in Europe. This is demonstrated cohort by cohort and through the life cycle. And this is perhaps surprising, again, vis-a-vis most of the literature that has emphasized becoming more estranged and more distant from the Jewish community. This is quite an extraordinary finding. I will now show a kind of attempt to synthesize the data just displayed. This map is a sort of graphical demonstration of the correlations that exist between the different options for being Jewish in Europe. You have the importance of Jewish culture, the importance of Jewish festivals, traditional festivals, the importance of believing in God, the importance of charity and organized community, the importance of fighting anti-Semitism and remembering the Holocaust. And at the center of this display, you have the importance of taking care of Israel and the importance of participating in Jewish peoplehood, that is, feeling Jewish. Now, these different options are all interesting, all relevant, and all accepted or preferred by some members of the Jewish community. But those who appear more centrally in this display are those around which there is, I would dare saying, a stronger consensus. That is, more people who may feel differently vis-a-vis, say, God or secular culture, do feel they agree on Jewish peoplehood and on feeling that Israel is a central component in their daily attention. Does not mean that all of them must support Israel. It means that the concept of Israel, the concept of the Jewish state is relevant, and they are preoccupied and they take care. And this kind of combination of the state of Israel and Jewish peoplehood has for sure strengthened over the last years. I would provide an interpretation which perhaps is not very the happiest I would give. I would believe that part of this is due to negative pressures that certainly do exist, and we are aware they exist in the non-Jewish environment surrounding the Jews. I mean, classic types of anti-Semitism, denial of the importance of the Shoah, and also denial of the legitimacy of the state of Israel. All of these, whether you take personally part or not in that, whether or not you have personally experienced a manifestation of that kind, all of this certainly causes a lot of concern among many Jews, and therefore, to some extent, in my view, it strengthens the sense of participation, the sense of belonging. I would finally because I'd like now to leave space to questions, and there are certainly many questions that will emerge from this conversation. I would finally try to address more directly the question of where does Europe go and where do the Jews go? This map is again, and it is taken from our report, again, a kind of graphical translation of the correlations between several important social indicators. On the central part, you have indicators of Jewish population. How many Jews, how many Jews per thousand in the total population. So these are the typical demographic numbers about the Jews in Europe. We refer here to 24 European countries, still including in this case the UK, which was part of the survey in 2018 and then still part of the European Union. On the left part of the diagram, you have indicators of development, the level of education of a country, the level of human development in that society, the level of the national product per capita in that society, the life expectancy, which is an indicator of health, and also the net migration balance of that country. All of these are general indicators of society. Now, a country which has a positive net migration is a country that attracts people, therefore is a country that probably has something to offer in terms of its economy, its democracy, maybe its society. And then on the other side of the diagram, we have indicators of something which, of course, tends to cause a decline in Jewish population. I'm saying that the growth of Jewish population will be strongly related to the quality of life in the host countries. The country is more hospitable, is more developed, is more democratic, then it attracts a larger Jewish population, as you can see from the proximity of the Jewish indicators to development. On the other hand, there are factors of decline. One, of course, is emigration from Europe. The more immigration you have, the more decline in Jewish population you have. The more this ratio, it means in effect a measure of assimilation. The more assimilated a community is, the more it will decline. And then finally, we have quite an extraordinary notion about the effect of anti-Semitism. We have two indicators of anti-Semitism, one on the left part of the diagram and one on the right part. On the left part, we have the data of the Eurobarometer, which is the European Union collection of social indicators, which says how much concerned is the general population about anti-Semitism. So the more concerned means that the Jewish population is better understood, is better defended. And in fact, we have a proximity between Jewish population and a higher concern about anti-Semitism. We also find that concern about anti-Semitism is related to development. So the more developed, the more enlightened societies have a higher concern about anti-Semitism. On the other hand, on the right part, we have another indicator of anti-Semitism. This is the Anti-Defamation League survey of 2014, where they tried to operationalize the amount of anti-Semitic prejudice among total society. So the more anti-Semitic prejudice, of course, the least propensity of the Jews to live in such society. But look at the extraordinary contraposition between being anti-Semitic in the total population, here on this right-hand part, and being concerned about anti-Semitism. It means that a society which is more concerned has less anti-Semitism, and a society which has more anti-Semitism is less concerned about anti-Semitism. The Jews, of course, will draw their conclusions. They will prefer to live in a society which is relatively free or not so much infected by anti-Semitism, and they will choose to stay, or maybe to reach that particular point over the European map. They will probably tend to leave those countries where the societal conditions tend to produce toxic agents that produce negative influences on the community, and therefore the propensity to leave. So finally, what we see is a very interesting dependency and correlation of Jewish life or whatever happens in Europe, both in terms of human technological and socioeconomic development, and also in terms of the cultural determinants of friendship or hostility toward the Jews. This means that we of course operate, the Jewish world operates fundamentally on the ground of its own historical principles, its values, which are universal and immortal, and certainly very attractive to a wide variety of people. But however, we cannot ignore that the Jews live in a container. The container is whatever society at large can produce. And so they are very sensitive to the conditions that prevail, and they will probably draw their conclusions, whether to stay, whether to attract more fellows, or whether to leave to another place in the world, may it be Israel or North America or other parts of the world. So I think we have, thanks to the surveys that we could organize, and also thanks to wide variety of different research materials, and now quite a new, detailed, and more in-depth vision of what has happened to European Jews in the long term, what is happening to them now, and to some extent, what are the prospects for a nice and productive, healthy Jewish life in Europe in the future generations. So I would stop here, and I'm sure that we have many questions, and we are ready to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. And apologies if people were having sound trouble. I know that some people were. Sergio, you might just want to move your microphone a little bit further away from you. That might help a little bit. But thank you very much for those for those introductory remarks, and also for the many questions that have come in. I'll start with a couple of historical ones. So there are two questions actually that have come in about slightly different periods. One from David Levy, who has suggested that from what he knows, about 10% of the Roman Empire I guess at the beginning of the Common Era was Jewish, of a population of about 70, and that by 1170 we're saying that the population had declined to 2 million. So if those figures are right, what explains that decline? And there's then another question, which is also sort of about historical data, which was about the rapid population growth that occurred in the 19th century leading up to 1880. And can you explain what the forces are behind that?
Okay, so looking at the Roman Empire, I would use some amount of caution. Of course, they didn't have the technical statistics that we have now. I think for sure there were big Jewish communities around the Roman Empire. Of course, in Alexandria, in Rome, and in many other places. And it's sure that this presence was visible. The question of the numbers, of course, has to be seen in perspective. The population of Europe, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, diminished very significantly. And so probably the population was larger at an earlier point in time than it was later during the Middle Ages, the data that I quoted. But I wish to underlie and stress a lesson which is perhaps more important than the numbers themselves. The lesson is this: in a circumstance where you have a regime, a cultural and political context that is more pluralistic, in a sense more open to diversity. And certainly the Romans, being pagan, they had many gods and a huge variety of populations under their wings. And it was not a monolith. And so there was a certain amount of tolerance not total, but certainly the Jews had space for being themselves, which in the course of history may have changed. On the one hand, the Christianization of the Roman Empire certainly had very negative consequences for the Jews. The rise of Christianity certainly caused persecutions and a standard which did not allow for differences and for minorities. And then later on, also, in a sense, nationalism was quite deleterious to the freedom and liberty and options, cultural options and social options of the Jews. So my lesson is that where you have societies or a kind of political framework which is more diverse, more open to differences, the Jews have greater space, so they can also grow demographically. Where they are constrained within one religious or one national option, and they do not conform, then their fate is very sad. And we have seen this repeatedly with again the rise of Christianity during the Roman Empire. Then there is a long period of Renaissance, which was very good to the Jews. Then the Catholic Counter-Reformation and the ghettos. It was a very bad period for the Jews. The Jewish population declined. People had to leave, and people had to move to different areas. And then again, emancipation and freedom was good for the Jews. They could thrive until, unfortunately, the fascism and the Nazi regimes and the Shoah caused the tragic collapse of European Jews. And the question, of course, is where are we going? Is Europe going toward, again, that type of framework which is open, liberal, and pluralistic? That would be good for the Jews. They would have a lot of space. Or is it going toward local nationalistic frameworks where the Jews will have a difficulty? This is a big question mark.
Thank you. Daniel, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I could. I think, thank you very much, Sergio. The only thing that I would add to that is that very often developments in Jewish population size, Jewish demographic history are seen, I'd say more often than not, they're seen on their own. But they happen in the context. They happen in the context of the world population, of the world demography. And I think Sergio, Professor DellaPergola chose to highlight the specifically Jewish element to it, and completely justifiable. This is what makes Jews unique. There was some degree of disassociation from Jewishness at that time, undoubtedly, not just today. But we also need to ask ourselves what happened to the rest of people in Europe at that time and in the world. And what happened to the rest of Europe is not very different from Jews. That is the truth of the matter. Well, there are some differences, but generally what we must remember is that before the demographic transition, i.e. before the transition to modernity, what we call modernity today, human populations didn't grow all that much. Mostly, they remain static. Mostly, and that's true of Jews and non-Jews. You don't need to belong to Jews to experience population stagnation. Why is that? Because before we transitioned as a human civilization to something that we call modernity, we lived under the regime, you can call it, of extreme wastefulness. The transition between modernity and between the time before the demographic transition and the time after it, the transition between them is a transition between wastefulness to economy. Under demographic regime of wastefulness, a lot of children are born, a lot of people die at the same time, and there's practically no growth. And that is true of Jews and non-Jews. And this links me, by the way, there was another question in the chat. Somebody asked, what happened in the 19th century? Why was such a strong population growth between 1825 and 1900, something like this? This is the mirror image of what happened before, or it's the opposite pole, the opposite end of what happened before. Before the demographic transition, we had stagnation, Jews and non-Jews. Then when demographic transition started, when modernity started, people started dying less And this is when growth happened. And it happened on an astonishing scale, more so among Jews than among non-Jews. But this difference, given the nature of the question, is almost trivial. What we Jews had at the time was demographic expansion on a major scale.
I beg to agree. I beg to disagree partly. I fully agree with Daniel, but it was not trivial at all. During the 19th century, the difference in the rates of growth between Jews and non-Jews in the same areas was quite amazing. In fact, that was the question I had not answered. What was the reason for growth? It's true that in general, the demographic transition is quite universal, but the pace and the timing of change were absolutely different. And Jewish populations in many respects anticipated the total societies of their environment in reducing the death rate significantly earlier than others. And then later on also in reducing the birth rate. But the interesting point is the early reduction in the death rate. And that I would explain fundamentally in taking into account two classes of factors. The first part, in my view, is definitely related to the widespread observance of Jewish traditions that may be conducive to relative advantage in terms of the standard of living and health. Of course, we are at very high levels of mortality. Let's not forget that. But the Jews had very specific rules about food and about personal hygiene, and also about taking care of their poorer fellows. There was not quite, but a sort of national insurance taking care of the poorer and therefore avoiding the most dramatic conditions that were so widespread among vagabonds and poor and the sick in general society. And also, if we look at the typology of causes of death, it is extraordinarily different among Jews than among non-Jews. For example, I have to mention that the incidence of alcoholic and also sexually transmitted disease in semi-traditional Jewish communities was significantly lower among Jews than among the total society. There were other conditions that might have been more frequent, but if we take altogether those factors in the first part of the demographic transition, Jewish communities were quite different. In the second part, the explanations become more socioeconomic, that is, being less exposed to dangerous occupations. You know, you have very few coal miners among Jews, and that's a very dangerous occupation. And you have tailors. Tailors are not very much endangered. And now part of this is the choice.
Sergio, I'm going to interrupt you because I want to get to other questions, and I think you've broadly speaking kind of captured I think some of the main reasons. So let's move on and take some other ones, because I think I don't want to focus too much on the history, because I think there are a lot of questions that have come in about the future and where things are heading. The questions, I think, can be sort of categorized in different ways. I mean, there's the general one, which is, tell us what you think the prospects are for European Jewry in the next 10, 20, 50 years. But there are also kind of, I think, questions here about projections in terms of different denominations, the effects of what's going to happen in terms of the Haredi profile, for example, or the Orthodox profile of European Jewry. There's another question about the balance between secular and Orthodox over time, and how that's shifting. So I wonder if you can relate a little bit to what you think is likely to happen based on the demographic data you can see, both from a general perspective and perhaps through that denominational lens.
Yeah, well, I think in general, all the time, Jewish reproduction has been selective, and certain parts of the Jewish population have reproduced more and have grown and have survived, and other parts of the Jewish population have reproduced less, and some have disappeared. Now, this unavoidably is also related to the amount of traditionalism. And now, if you look at contemporary Jewish communities, there is no question that the Haredi component is having a higher birth rate and therefore a higher rate of growth. And therefore, it constitutes a growing proportion of the total. This is true all across Europe. This is true in Israel. This is true even in the US, where the Haredi population may be relatively smaller segment. On the other hand, the most extreme forms of disenchantment, lack of interest, slash assimilation, and abandoning are usually among the more modern and secularized sections of the Jewish community. So there is one part which does not really reproduce. People may remain within the community even if their children are not, but this is a phenomenon that cannot be totally neglected. And so therefore, what remains within the community is a selection of what was there in the previous generation. This is a well-known mechanism. We see that in the UK, we see that in Israel, to the point that projections that we have show that eventually the proportions of the very religious, the very traditional will be amazingly higher in the future than it is now. This, of course, opens a whole scenario about the socioeconomic self-sustenance of those communities who really generally receive some support, if not subsidy, by other segments of the Jewish population, or in the case of Israel, by the state. So, but this is a fact that we have to take into account. On the other hand, I tried very much in my presentation to outline a mechanism which in a sense is contrary. That is, I very much insisted on the return to the center of sections of the Jewish community that in the past we saw as very peripheral and even alienated. So this is in a sense a counterbalancing process which has to be understood and caught very rapidly and carefully and efficiently by the organized community. This is an opportunity to keep inside people who otherwise would escape. And therefore, the balance is not going to change so dramatically as it might otherwise.
Thank you. There's a question here about your comments about increased religiosity in the Jewish population, and question from Michelle Shane, and a similar question also from Professor Steve Miller about whether that's really a methodological artifact. Could it be that the less religious are simply not participating in surveys or not part of the sampling frame in some way?
Well, of course, if you have a survey, you have in the survey those who participated in the survey, and you don't have the others. What I presented was a lifetime change of those who participated in the survey. And the lifetime change undisputably shows a certain increase in religiosity, lifetime among the same persons. The truth is that our sample is, in my view, sufficiently diverse. It may not be perfect because it was performed starting initially from Jewish organizations and Jewish networks, and it was disseminated through the internet. It is not truly a random sample, and it would be nearly impossible to have a perfect random sample, but it is a wide variety of types and situations and attitudes that we were able to catch because the central topic of the FRA study was anti-Semitism. And there cannot be any doubt that anti-Semitism is a topic of broad concern, not only to the religious, but also to the secular, not only to the more interested in the state of Israel, but also to those who are not. I mean, it is really a cross-section of people who feel that. Of course, those who are absolutely ignorant of anti-Semitism, they have never perceived anything. They don't know even what anti-Semitism is. Probably they were less interested in participating in the survey. So I recognize there is a certain inherent bias, but the bias is not going to affect those life cycle cohort changes. By the way, we did the same exercise in Israel and in the United States, and the results are dramatically different. Because in the United States, you would have exactly the contrary. Each cohort is less religious than the previous one. In Europe, it is more. And each cohort life cycle becomes less religious than a childhood. And in Israel, it becomes more. So having, in a sense, a similar bias, because that's also a sample which is not absolutely perfect, you see that you get something of value in terms of understanding the life cycle dynamics of those you could put your hands on, admitting that any survey has imperfections.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and we said we would finish at 6 o'clock. I'm also aware that there are lots of questions that came in that we just haven't had time to deal with today. So we will. I think what we should probably do is organise another event in a month or so where we can continue the conversation, and we'll certainly let people know about that. So that, you know, because I think there's so much here to mine and digest and explore. But I would encourage people to download the report. It's on the JPR website again. jpr.org.uk. But let me finish by handing over to the chair of JPR, and just first of all, just to thank Sergio and to Daniel for their comments and for their incredible work. And let me finish by handing over to Stephen Moss, the chair of JPR, just for a few closing words. Stephen.
Thank you very much, John. And first of all, thank you all for joining us, and our apologies if elements of this was a little hard to hear. But it was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you'll all agree. And so my personal thanks to Sergio for his presentation, and both to him and to Daniel for all the work they did on this report. And of course to Sally Berkovich and her trustees and team at Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, because without them, we wouldn't have a JPR European Demography unit. And it's a unit that we at JPR want to see grow, because we want to do more to support Jewish life across Europe by providing high quality research to leaders and policymakers who want to do more themselves and want the information, objective, independent information, in order to make strategic decisions for the future. And of course, to do that, we need to invest more in our demography unit. So whether you're an individual listening to this who could make a small donation, or an institution that could give us thousands, do consider helping to support our work, because it really would make a difference to our ability to have impact. And so if you believe in the impact that high quality independent research can provide in a world where truth is taking a bit of a battering, and if you want European Jewish communities to thrive, then you share our goals for the demography unit. And don't hesitate, if you are inspired to help us, to make a donation by going on the JPR website or by contacting us directly to arrange a chat. Once again, really, my sincere thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and to our participants. And please stay safe, stay well, and have a good day, or a good afternoon, or a good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So thank you all for joining us, and bye for now.